Lamia wiped sweat from her forehead, the afternoon sun relentless over the bustling streets. She had been working since dawn in her family's small cafe, juggling customers and carrying heavy trays of steaming food. As tired as she was, Lamia loved the energy of her surroundings, where life thrived in every corner. Today, her mind wandered, distracted by a conversation she had overheard between two women at the cafe. They had whispered about a man named Mwangi, a wealthy businessman who had recently returned to expand his empire. The women's voices had been filled with excitement as they described his sharp features and intense presence. Lamia had brushed off such talk before, but this time something in her stirred. The cafe bell jingled as a man stepped inside, bringing with him a wave of cool air. Lamia turned, and her breath caught. There he was, Mwangi. Tall and impeccably dressed, his dark eyes scanned the room with a confidence that seemed to ripple through the space. He walked to the counter, and Lamia could feel the weight of his presence before he even spoke. "One black coffee," he said, his voice deep and smooth. Lamia nodded quickly, her heart pounding unexpectedly. As she prepared the coffee, she stole a glance at him. There was something about him, his calm yet commanding aura, that captivated her. Handing him the cup, their fingers brushed briefly, sending a jolt through her. Mwangi's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than expected, his eyes carrying an unspoken message. In that brief exchange, their worlds collided. After Mwangi left the cafe, Lamia couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside her. His brief touch, the look in his eyes, it all left her unsettled. She busied herself with the usual routine, but her thoughts kept returning to him. The rest of the day passed in a blur. As she wiped down tables and closed the cafe for the night, she found herself thinking about the rumors she had overheard. Mwangi had a reputation, a man of power, wealth, and mystery. The type of person who seemed so far removed from her simple life. What would he want from a place like this? Later that evening, sitting on the balcony of her small apartment, Lamia watched the stars overhead. She thought about her life, how ordinary it seemed compared to the stories whispered about men like Mwangi. She had always worked hard, helping her family and dreaming of a future that seemed distant. A future where she could finally have a life of her own. The night air was cool, and a gentle breeze brushed against her skin. Despite the calm, her mind refused to settle. She replayed the moment when their hands had touched and the way his eyes had lingered on her. There was something in that moment, something she couldn't quite understand, but it made her heart race. As she lay in bed, her thoughts drifted between curiosity and disbelief. What could a man like Mwangi possibly see in her? She convinced herself it was nothing, just a brief encounter. Yet, as she closed her eyes, she couldn't shake the feeling that she would see him again. Little did she know, her world was about to change in ways she never imagined. The next day, Lamia returned to her routine, trying to push Mwangi from her thoughts. She convinced herself that their encounter was fleeting, nothing more than a passing moment. Life would go on as usual. But fate had other plans. In the early afternoon, while she was serving customers, the bell at the cafe door rang again. Lamia turned, and her heart skipped a beat. Mwangi stood at the entrance, his presence filling the room just as it had before. This time, he wasn't alone. Two men followed closely behind him, their suits as sharp as his, but their eyes lacked the warmth that his held. Mwangi's gaze found hers almost instantly, and a small, unreadable smile appeared on his face. He nodded in her direction, then made his way to a corner table. Lamia's hands trembled as she walked over to take his order. "Coffee again?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mwangi smiled. "Not today. I'll have tea, and—" He paused for a moment, looking at her intently. "What would you recommend to eat?" Lamia blinked, caught off guard by the question. No one ever asked her opinion. "The rice with vegetables is very good," she managed to say. "Then I'll have that," he replied, his eyes never leaving hers. Lamia quickly scribbled down the order and hurried back to the kitchen, her heart racing. Why was he back? And why did he seem so interested in her? She couldn't help but feel nervous. But beneath the nerves, there was something else, an undeniable excitement. As she served his meal, Mwangi spoke again. "You seem familiar. Have we met before?" Lamia shook her head, confused. "No, I don't think so." Mwangi's smile deepened. "Perhaps not, but something tells me we will." Lamia couldn't concentrate for the rest of the day. Mwangi's words echoed in her mind. Something tells me we will. What did he mean? Was it a promise or just polite conversation? She wasn't sure, but the way he looked at her, as though he knew something she didn't, unsettled her in the most unexpected way. That evening, after the cafe had closed, Lamia sat outside on the steps, lost in thought. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a soft glow on the quiet street. Her mind raced, trying to piece together why a man like Mwangi would show interest in her, someone who led such a simple life. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. Lamia? She looked up, startled to see Mwangi standing in front of her. His sudden appearance sent a shock through her, and she jumped to her feet. I didn't mean to startle you, he said, his voice calm and reassuring. I was just passing by and thought I'd stop to say hello. Lamia's heart raced, her mind scrambling for something to say. Oh, it's fine, she managed, her voice shaky. I was just thinking. Mwangi smiled, his eyes warm but curious. Thinking about what? Lamia hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Life, I guess, she said finally. Sometimes it's hard to know where it's going. Mwangi nodded, his expression thoughtful. I understand. Life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. There was a pause, the air thick with unspoken words. Lamia could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She had never felt this way before. This strange mix of curiosity, fear, and excitement. She barely knew Mwangi, yet something about him drew her in. As the night grew darker, Mwangi glanced at his watch. I should go, but I hope to see you again, Lamia. Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her standing there, wondering what just happened. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions for Lamia. She found herself thinking about Mwangi far more than she should. Every time the cafe door jingled, her heart raced, half expecting to see him walk in again. But he didn't. Not for days. Her routine carried on, yet everything felt different. It was as if their brief conversations had stirred something deep inside her. She couldn't help but wonder if he was thinking about her too, or if she had simply imagined the connection between them. Then, on a quiet afternoon, the bell rang. Lamia looked up, and there he was. Mwangi walked in, his presence as commanding as ever, but this time there was something different about him. He looked more relaxed, even casual, as though he had come not just for a meal, but for a reason beyond food. He smiled when he saw her, and Lamia's pulse quickened. She walked over to his table, trying to maintain her composure. Tea again? She asked, her voice betraying her excitement. Mwangi chuckled softly. Yes, but only if you join me. Lamia froze. Join you? She repeated, surprised. Mwangi nodded, his smile warm and inviting. You've been working so hard every time I come in. You deserve a break. Lamia hesitated, unsure if this was appropriate. But something about his kindness and the genuine look in his eyes made her say yes. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat across from him, feeling a strange mix of excitement and nerves. As they talked, Lamia realized how easy it was to open up to him. They spoke about life, dreams, and the future. With every word, Lamia felt the connection between them grow. By the time they finished their tea, Lamia knew this was only the beginning. Though their conversations were light, filled with laughter and stories of everyday life, Lamia couldn't shake the feeling that there was still a distance between them, a gap that no amount of words could close. Mwangi intrigued her. He was kind, charming, and mysterious. But beneath the surface, she could sense something more, something he wasn't telling her. His wealth, his connections, the way people whispered his name with reverence, there was a world he belonged to that she had no part in. For Lamia, life was simple. She worked, cared for her family, and hoped for a better future. But for Mwangi, it seemed like his life was more complex, more layered. She wondered what it would be like to walk in his shoes, to live in the world of high expectations and endless opportunities. One evening, as they sat together after the cafe had closed, Lamia decided to ask him about it. You always seem so calm, she said, glancing at him. But I feel like there's more to you than you let on. Mwangi's eyes darkened slightly, and he looked away, as if debating whether to let her in on his secret. After a long pause, he finally spoke. You're right, he admitted quietly. There's a lot about my life that I don't share. It's complicated. Lamia frowned, waiting for him to explain. I come from a family that expects a lot from me, he continued, his voice lower now. There's pressure, responsibility, and not much room for personal choices. Lamia felt her heart ache for him. Despite his wealth and power, Mwangi seemed just as trapped by his circumstances as she was by hers. For the first time, she realized that even the most privileged people carried burdens. But would those burdens push them apart? Days passed, and with every meeting, Lamia's feelings for Mwangi grew stronger. She tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself that it was just a passing infatuation, but it was becoming impossible to deny. Every time he walked into the cafe, her heart leaped, and every conversation left her wanting more. Mwangi, too, seemed drawn to her, though he remained careful not to cross any boundaries. Their interactions were always polite, respectful, and yet, beneath the surface, there was a tension, an unspoken desire that neither of them dared to acknowledge. One evening, as they sat together at a small table near the back of the cafe, the air between them felt charged. Lamia found herself watching the way his hands moved as he spoke, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her. She felt an overwhelming urge to ask him the question that had been lingering in her mind for days. "What do you want, Mwangi?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mwangi looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing, as though weighing his answer carefully. "I want," he began, then stopped, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I want a life that's mine, not one that's dictated by what others expect of me." Lamia's breath caught in her throat. She understood that feeling all too well, the desire for freedom, for control over one's own destiny. But as much as she wanted to believe that they could have something together, the reality of their differences loomed over her like a shadow. "Is that even possible?" she asked, her voice tinged with sadness. Mwangi met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw something raw in his eyes. "I don't know," he admitted softly, "but I'd like to find out." As their connection deepened, so did the complications surrounding it. Lamia and Mwangi came from different worlds, and with each passing day, those differences became harder to ignore. Lamia often found herself wondering how this story could possibly end well. One evening, after the cafe had closed and Mwangi was walking her home, they passed by a group of men talking loudly on the street corner. As they approached, one of the men recognized Mwangi. "Hey, isn't that the businessman who's been throwing money around?" one of them shouted, his voice laced with mockery. Lamia stiffened, glancing nervously at Mwangi. But Mwangi remained calm, simply nodding at the man before continuing on. Once they were out of earshot, he sighed heavily. "People assume a lot about me," he said, his voice quiet. "They see the money, the success, and think that's all there is to me." Lamia frowned, feeling a surge of frustration on his behalf. "That's not fair." Mwangi smiled, though there was no joy in it. Life rarely is. They walked in silence for a while, the weight of unspoken thoughts hanging between them. Lamia felt torn between her growing feelings for Mwangi and the reality of their situation. Could she really see herself with him? Could they ever bridge the gap between their worlds? As they reached the door to her apartment, Mwangi paused. He turned to her, his expression serious. "Lamia," he began, his voice hesitant. "I know we come from different places and I know this won't be easy, but I can't stop thinking about you." Lamia's heart skipped a beat. She had been waiting for him to say something, but hearing the words made everything more real. "I can't stop thinking about you either," she confessed, her voice barely audible. Mwangi smiled, his eyes softening. "Then maybe we can figure this out together." The days following their confession felt different. A new energy pulsed between Lamia and Mwangi, one that was charged with the possibilities of what could be. They both knew the challenges they faced. Coming from such different worlds meant their relationship wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, neither of them seemed to care. One afternoon, Mwangi invited Lamia out for a walk. It wasn't unusual for them to spend time together, but this felt different. As they strolled through the market, Mwangi seemed distracted, glancing at her every few moments, as if there was something he wanted to say but couldn't find the words. Finally, they reached a quiet spot by a small stream, and Mwangi stopped, turning to face her. "I've been thinking about us," he began, his voice soft yet determined. "And I want to make this work, Lamia. I know it won't be simple, and there will be people who won't understand, but I can't walk away from this." Lamia's heart swelled. She had been afraid that he might change his mind, that the weight of his responsibilities, his family, and his world would be too much. But hearing him say those words gave her hope. I want this too, she admitted, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. But what about your family, your business? Will they accept this? Mwangi sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. My family has expectations, and they may not agree with my choices. But that's something I'm willing to face, for you, for us. The sincerity in his voice melted any lingering doubts she had. Lamia smiled, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Then we'll face it together, she said, reaching out to take his hand. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it felt like the first step toward a new beginning. Word of Mwangi and Lamia's growing closeness spread faster than they anticipated. The cafe patrons began whispering when they saw them together, and soon enough, it wasn't just idle gossip anymore. People who knew Mwangi began to notice too, and their reactions were far from welcoming. One evening, as Lamia was closing up the cafe, a sleek black car pulled up outside. She didn't think much of it until two well-dressed women stepped out, their eyes immediately locking onto her. They entered the cafe with an air of superiority, their sharp gazes taking in every detail of the modest place. Lamia's heart sank. She didn't need to ask who they were. Everything about them screamed wealth and privilege. You must be Lamia, one of the women said, her tone clipped. She had a regal bearing, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping lightly on the counter. Lamia swallowed, nodding. Yes, can I help you? The woman smiled, but it was cold. I'm Layla, Mwangi's sister. This is our cousin, Nia. The pit in Lamia's stomach deepened. She hadn't met any of Mwangi's family yet, and this was far from how she imagined the introduction. We've heard a lot about you, Nia added, her voice dripping with condescension, though we find it hard to believe our dear Mwangi would be involved with someone like you. Lamia felt her face flush with anger, but she forced herself to remain calm. She wasn't going to let them intimidate her. I'm not sure what you're getting at, but if you're here to judge me, you can leave. Layla's smile faltered, replaced by a hardened expression. You don't belong in his world, Lamia. Whatever you think you have with him, it won't last. Mwangi has obligations that don't include you. Lamia's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood her ground. That's for Mwangi to decide, not you. The two women exchanged a glance, then turned to leave without another word. As they stepped outside, Layla looked back over her shoulder, her eyes cold. You'll see soon enough. When they were gone, Lamia collapsed into a chair, her body trembling. She knew Mwangi's world was different, but now she realized just how hard it would be to fit into it. Later that evening, Lamia couldn't shake the conversation with Mwangi's sister and cousin from her mind. The way they had looked at her, as if she was nothing more than an inconvenience, a roadblock in Mwangi's life. Their words echoed in her thoughts, filling her with doubt. She had always known that their relationship would be complicated, but until now, it had been something distant, something they would face later. Now, it felt real, too real. When Mwangi came to see her that night, she could barely look at him. He noticed immediately. What's wrong? He asked, sitting down beside her, concern etched on his face. Lamia sighed, unsure of how to begin. Your sister and cousin came to see me today. Mwangi's expression darkened. What did they say? Lamia hesitated, then finally told him everything. The way they had belittled her made her feel like she didn't belong in his world. As she spoke, Mwangi's jaw clenched, his anger rising. They had no right to do that, he said through gritted teeth. I'll talk to them. They need to understand that this is my life, not theirs. Lamia shook her head. It's not just them, Mwangi. It's everyone. People look at us and see two people from different worlds. How can we make this work if no one accepts it? Mwangi reached for her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. I don't care what they think. I care about you, and I'm willing to fight for this, no matter what anyone says. His words touched her deeply, but the doubt still lingered. But what about your family, your responsibilities? I'll handle it, Mwangi said, his voice resolute. I've spent my whole life living for others, doing what's expected of me. But this is the one thing I want for myself. I want you, Lamia. His confession left her breathless. She knew he meant it, but the weight of his words also made her realize how difficult the road ahead would be. Was she ready to face that kind of fight? Mwangi didn't waste any time confronting his family. The next day, he called a meeting with his sister Layla and their cousin Nia, determined to set things straight. Lamia was part of his life, and he wasn't going to let anyone stand in the way of that. As expected, the conversation was tense. "You're being reckless, Mwangi," Layla snapped, her voice sharp. "This girl, she's not one of us. She doesn't understand our world. You can't build a future with someone who doesn't fit." Mwangi's eyes narrowed, his patience wearing thin. Lamia is smart, kind, and strong. Those are the things that matter, not where she comes from. Nia folded her arms, her expression skeptical. "Do you really think Father will approve? He has plans for you, plans that don't involve someone like her." Mwangi's heart pounded in his chest. His father. That was the one battle he wasn't sure he could win. His father's expectations weighed heavily on him, and he knew this wouldn't be easy. But he was tired of living his life on other people's terms. "I'll talk to him," Mwangi said, his voice firm. "But this is my decision, not his." Layla shook her head, her face softening with concern. "I'm only saying this because I care about you, Mwangi. You've worked so hard to get where you are. Don't throw it all away for something that might not last." Mwangi stared at her, the conflict in his heart clear. He loved his family, but this was different. Lamia was different. "This isn't just some passing thing, Layla. I love her." The room fell silent. Layla's eyes widened in surprise, and even Naya seemed taken aback. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, Layla sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Then I hope you know what you're doing." Mwangi left the meeting with his sister and cousin, feeling the weight of their disapproval, but his resolve remained strong. He had spoken his truth. He loved Lamia, and no matter how hard it became, he wouldn't let go of that. Yet, in the quiet of his thoughts, the looming conversation with his father weighed heavily on his mind. Later that evening, Mwangi found himself at Lamia's cafe once more. The familiar surroundings brought him a sense of peace, even though he knew the real battle was just beginning. Lamia greeted him with a warm smile, but he could see the worry in her eyes. "How did it go?" she asked, handing him a cup of tea. Mwangi sighed, running a hand through his hair. "As expected. Layla and Nia don't approve, but it doesn't matter. I told them I'm serious about you." Lamia's eyes softened. "But your father?" Mwangi stared into his cup, the liquid rippling under his gaze. "I haven't spoken to him yet." Silence stretched between them, the weight of the situation settling in. Lamia sat down across from him, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. She didn't need to ask how difficult that conversation would be. She knew. She could feel it in the tension that filled the air between them. "I don't want to be the reason you lose your family," Lamia said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mwangi's eyes snapped up, his gaze intense. "You won't be. This isn't about losing anything. It's about choosing what kind of life I want to live. And I want to live it with you." Lamia's heart swelled, a mixture of fear and hope swirling inside her. She knew the fight ahead wouldn't be easy, but hearing Mwangi's words filled her with a strength she hadn't realized she possessed. "If we're going to do this," she said softly, reaching across the table to take his hand, "then we do it together." Mwangi squeezed her hand, his resolve hardening. Together. Mwangi couldn't delay the inevitable any longer. A week after his conversation with Layla and Nia, he decided it was time to face his father. It had been hanging over his head, the weight of his family's expectations pressing down on him like a storm cloud. But if he was going to build a future with Lamia, he had to make his stand. That evening, Mwangi drove out to his family's sprawling estate, the familiar landscape both comforting and intimidating. As he pulled up to the grand house, his heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with the possible outcomes of the conversation that lay ahead. His father, Mr. Tembo, was waiting for him in the study, a room filled with leather-bound books and the scent of old wood. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows on the walls. Mr. Tembo looked up as Mwangi entered, his sharp eyes narrowing in curiosity. "You wanted to see me, son?" his father asked, his voice deep and commanding. Mwangi nodded, his throat tightening. He had rehearsed this conversation in his mind 100 times, but now that the moment was here, the words seemed to stick in his throat. There's something I need to tell you, Mwangi began, his voice steady but quiet. I've met someone. Her name is Lamia, and I love her. Mr. Tembo's expression didn't change, but his silence spoke volumes. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving his son's face. And, he prompted, his voice deceptively calm. Mwangi took a deep breath. She's not from the same world as us. She works in a cafe. Her family is humble. But she's everything I want. I need you to understand that. Mr. Tembo's lips thinned, his eyes hardening. A woman with no standing, no connections? Is that what you're telling me? Mwangi clenched his fists, his resolve tested. It doesn't matter where she comes from. What matters is who she is. The room fell into a tense silence. Mr. Tembo stared at his son for what felt like an eternity before he finally spoke. You've always been smart, Mwangi. You've built a name for yourself, and I've been proud of what you've achieved. But this is a mistake. Mwangi's heart sank, but he refused to back down. It's not a mistake. It's my life. His father's gaze darkened. If you choose her, you'll be choosing a life without this family's support. Mwangi left the meeting with his father, feeling as though the ground had been ripped out from under him. The weight of his father's words, "You'll be choosing a life without this family's support," echoed in his mind, each word cutting deeper than the last. He had known this would be difficult, but he hadn't expected the ultimatum to be so harsh, so final. Driving back to the cafe, Mwangi's thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and frustration. His father was a man of tradition, of status. He had always known that, but facing the reality of it was harder than he had imagined. When he arrived at the cafe, Lamia was waiting for him. She could see the strain in his expression, the heaviness in his movements as he sat down beside her. Without a word, she placed a cup of tea in front of him, her eyes filled with concern. "What happened?" she asked gently. Mwangi sighed, staring down at the tea without really seeing it. "My father, he won't accept us. He said if I choose you, I'm choosing a life without his support." Lamia's heart sank, her worst fears coming true. She had known this would be hard, but hearing it said aloud made it all too real. "I don't want to come between you and your family," she whispered, her voice laced with sadness. Mwangi reached for her hand, his grip firm and steady. "You're not. This is my decision. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I'm not going to let them dictate how I live my life. I choose you, Lamia. I'll always choose you." Tears welled in Lamia's eyes, her heart swelling with both love and fear. She knew how much Mwangi's family meant to him, how hard it was for him to defy them like this, and yet he was willing to do it for her. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mwangi smiled softly, brushing a tear from her cheek. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Lamia leaned into his embrace, feeling the warmth of his love and the weight of the sacrifices they would have to make. Together, they would face whatever came next, but the path ahead was filled with uncertainty. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. Mwangi and Lamia had made their choice. They would be together, no matter what. But that decision didn't come without consequences. Mwangi's family, particularly his father, had made it clear that they wouldn't support the relationship, and that weighed heavily on him. Mwangi tried to go about his daily life, running his business and managing his responsibilities, but everything felt different now. The tension between him and his family was palpable. He avoided family gatherings, knowing that every meeting would only deepen the divide. Lamia, too, felt the strain. Though Mwangi assured her that they could make it work, she couldn't help but feel the distance growing between them and the world around them. Every time they were out together, she noticed the looks, the whispers from people who didn't understand how a man like Mwangi could be with someone like her. One evening, as they sat together in her apartment, Lamia voiced the thoughts that had been weighing on her. "Do you think we're making a mistake?" she asked quietly, her gaze focused on the view outside the window. Mwangi frowned, turning to face her. "Why would you think that?" Lamia sighed, her fingers nervously twisting the fabric of her dress. "I see the way people look at us. I hear the things they say. I know this isn't easy for you, and I don't want to be the reason you lose everything." Mwangi moved closer, taking her hands in his. "Lamia, I don't care what people think. I don't care what my family thinks. What matters is us. We're building something real, something that no one else can understand. Lamia looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity there, but still, the doubt lingered. I just, I don't want you to regret this. Mwangi shook his head, pulling her into his arms. The only thing I'd regret is not being with you. Their love remained strong, but the weight of the outside world seemed to seep into every corner of their lives. It was a constant presence, always lurking, always threatening to pull them apart. One afternoon, Lamia's mother visited her at the cafe. She had heard about Mwangi, of course, the whole community had. Lamia had kept her relationship with him as quiet as possible, but it was impossible to hide from her family. As they sat together in the small, familiar space, Lamia's mother spoke cautiously, her tone laced with concern. Lamia, I've heard about this man you're seeing, her mother began, her hands resting on the table between them. People talk, and they're saying things that worry me. Lamia sighed, already knowing where this conversation was headed. I know what people are saying, Mama, but Mwangi isn't like they think. He loves me. Her mother frowned, her brow furrowing in concern. I'm sure he does, but love isn't always enough. You come from different worlds, my daughter. His family, his wealth, his status, it's all so far from where we come from. Do you really think you can live in that world? Lamia felt her heart tighten. She had asked herself the same question so many times, but hearing her mother voice it made it harder to push aside. I don't know, Lamia admitted, her voice small. But I love him, Mama, and he loves me. Her mother reached across the table, taking her hand gently. I know you do, but love isn't always enough to bridge the gap between worlds like yours and his. You have to think about your future, about whether you can really be happy in a life that's so different from the one you know. Lamia's chest tightened with the weight of her mother's words. Deep down, she knew her mother was right. There were parts of Mwangi's world that she couldn't relate to, things she couldn't understand, but the thought of walking away from him felt unbearable. I don't want to lose him, Lamia whispered, her voice breaking. Her mother squeezed her hand. I know, my dear, but sometimes holding on to something that's slipping away only hurts more in the end. That night, Lamia lay in bed, her mind racing with thoughts of her conversation with her mother. The doubts that had been growing inside her now felt like a storm, threatening to engulf her entirely. She loved Mwangi, but was love enough? Could they really survive in a world where everything seemed to conspire against them? The next day, Mwangi came by the cafe to see her, as he often did. But today, Lamia felt the tension between them more than ever. She could barely meet his eyes, the weight of her doubts pressing down on her like a heavy burden. What's wrong? Mwangi asked, sensing the shift in her mood. Lamia bit her lip, unsure of how to say what had been on her mind for days. Finally, she took a deep breath and spoke. I've been thinking, she began slowly, her voice wavering, about us, about whether we can really make this work. Mwangi's face fell, his eyes searching hers for an explanation. What are you talking about? Of course, we can make this work. Lamia shook her head, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. But can we? Mwangi, your family doesn't accept me. People talk about us like we're a mistake waiting to happen. I feel like I'm pulling you away from the life you were meant to live. Mwangi reached for her hands, holding them tightly in his. You're not pulling me away from anything. I told you, I choose you, Lamia. I don't care what people say. But I care, Lamia whispered, her voice breaking. I care that I don't fit into your world. I care that your family will never accept me. And I care that maybe one day you'll regret choosing me over everything else. Mwangi's heart ached at her words. He had never thought about it that way, never considered that she might feel like she didn't belong in his world. But now that she was saying it, he could see the fear and doubt in her eyes. Lamia, I love you, he said softly, his voice filled with emotion, and I will fight for you, for us. But I need you to believe that we can make this work. Lamia wiped away a tear, her heart torn between her love for Mwangi and the reality of their situation. I don't know if I can, Mwangi. I don't know if I'm strong enough. Mwangi pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she cried softly against his chest. He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't ready to give up on her. As the weeks passed, the strain on Lamia and Mwangi's relationship continued to grow. They tried to hold on to each other, but the pressure from the outside world was relentless. Mwangi's family had not relented in their disapproval, and Lamia's own doubts grew louder with each passing day. One evening, Mwangi invited Lamia to a dinner with his family, hoping to bridge the gap that had grown between them. He believed that if they could see how much he loved her, how serious he was about their relationship, they might come around. Lamia agreed, though her heart was heavy with dread. She had never felt comfortable around Mwangi's family, but she wanted to support him, to give their love one last chance. When they arrived at the grand family estate, the tension was palpable. Mwangi's father barely acknowledged Lamia's presence, while his sister, Layla, cast cold glances her way. The dinner was formal, every conversation stilted and heavy with unspoken judgments. Halfway through the meal, Mr. Tembo cleared his throat, addressing Mwangi with a tone of finality. "Son, it's time for you to think about your future," he said, his voice deep and commanding. "Your responsibilities to this family, to our legacy. You can't waste your life on distractions." Mwangi stiffened, his jaw clenched. "Lamia is not a distraction." His father's eyes narrowed. "She's not one of us. She never will be. It's time you realize that." Lamia's heart shattered at the cold words, but she kept her face composed, not wanting to show how deeply they hurt. She had always known that Mwangi's family didn't accept her, but hearing it said aloud in front of everyone felt like the final blow. Mwangi stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'm done with this," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "If you can't accept Lamia, then you can't accept me." Without waiting for a response, he grabbed Lamia's hand and led her out of the room, his heart pounding with rage and frustration. But as they reached the front door, Lamia stopped, pulling her hand free from his grasp. "Mwangi, wait," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't do this." Mwangi turned to her, his eyes wide with confusion. "What do you mean? We don't need them, Lamia. We can be together without their approval." Lamia shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I can't be the reason you lose your family. I can't live in a world where I'll always be the outsider." Mwangi's heart broke at her words, but he could see the truth in her eyes. She was pulling away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "Lamia, please," he whispered, his voice filled with desperation. But Lamia shook her head, stepping back. "I love you, Mwangi, but I can't keep fighting this battle. It's tearing us apart." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Mwangi standing in the doorway, his heart shattered into pieces. In the days that followed, silence fell between Mwangi and Lamia like an impenetrable wall. Mwangi's world felt empty without her, the spaces they once shared now filled with an aching void. He threw himself into his work, hoping it would distract him from the pain, but nothing seemed to help. Every quiet moment was a reminder of what he had lost. Lamia, too, felt the weight of the separation. Her heart ached every time she thought of Mwangi, but she convinced herself that it was the right decision. She couldn't ask him to choose between her and his family, and the pain of being constantly reminded that she didn't belong in his world was too much to bear. She tried to move on, to focus on her work at the cafe and her family, but everything reminded her of him. His laughter, his smile, the way he looked at her with such deep affection. Days turned into weeks, and still, neither of them reached out to the other. It was as though they were trapped in a silent agreement that the separation was necessary, even though both their hearts were breaking. Mwangi spent his days haunted by the memory of her walking away, while Lamia spent hers wondering if she had made the biggest mistake of her life. One evening, as Lamia sat alone in her small apartment, staring out at the stars, she felt an overwhelming sense of loss. She missed Mwangi with every fiber of her being, and the thought of never seeing him again was unbearable. But just as she was about to reach for her phone, doubt crept in. What if he had already moved on? What if he had accepted that they were from different worlds and it wasn't meant to be? As the night grew darker, Lamia set her phone aside, letting her thoughts consume her. But deep down, a small part of her still hoped that Mwangi would come back for her, that somehow they could find a way to be together. Mwangi had never felt so lost. No matter how much he tried to convince himself that walking away from his family for Lamia had been the right thing to do, the emptiness in his heart only grew. He missed her more than he thought possible, and no amount of work, friends, or distractions could fill the space she had left behind. His father had made it clear that Lamia would never be accepted into their family, but that wasn't what hurt the most. What hurt was knowing that Lamia had walked away, believing she didn't belong in his world. It had been weeks, and Mwangi hadn't spoken to her since that night. He wasn't sure if she even wanted to hear from him. But one night, as Mwangi sat alone in his office, staring blankly at his phone, something inside him shifted. He realized he couldn't go on like this. He couldn't let fear or pride keep him from the woman he loved. No matter what his family thought, no matter what obstacles stood in their way, he had to try. Without overthinking it, he picked up the phone and called her. The ringing seemed to last forever, each passing second amplifying his fear that she wouldn't answer. But just as he was about to give up, Lamia's voice came through the line. "Hello?" Mwangi's heart skipped a beat at the sound of her voice, soft and hesitant, just as he remembered. For a moment, he couldn't find the words. Then, with a deep breath, he spoke. "Lamia, it's me." There was a pause on the other end of the line, the silence stretching between them. Mwangi's pulse quickened, his fear growing that she wouldn't want to talk to him. "Mwangi," she whispered, her voice filled with both surprise and sadness. "Why are you calling?" Mwangi closed his eyes, his emotions spilling over. "Because I can't do this anymore. I can't pretend that I'm okay without you. I know we've both been through so much, but I need you to know that I'm not giving up on us." Lamia's breath hitched, the vulnerability in his voice piercing through her heart. "Mwangi, it's not that simple." "I know it's not," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "But I'm willing to fight for us, even if the whole world is against it. I just need to know if you still feel the same." For a moment, the silence between them was unbearable. Lamia felt tears slip down her cheeks, her emotions raw and overwhelming. She had missed him more than she could ever admit, and hearing his voice stirred something inside her that she had been trying to bury. "I still love you," she whispered, her voice trembling, "but I don't know how we can make this work." Mwangi's heart soared at her words. It was all he needed to hear. "We'll find a way," he promised. Together. After their phone call, Mwangi and Lamia agreed to meet and talk in person. Both of them were filled with nervous anticipation as they prepared to face the deep emotions they had kept at bay for weeks. They met at a small, quiet park, a place that felt far removed from the chaos of their lives. When Lamia saw Mwangi approaching, her heart raced. He looked the same as always, calm, confident, but there was something softer in his eyes, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. Mwangi's heart swelled when he saw her, the sight of her filling him with a sense of peace he hadn't felt since they parted. They sat on a bench beneath a large tree, neither of them speaking for a moment. The air was thick with the weight of everything unsaid. Finally, Mwangi broke the silence. "I'm sorry, Lamia," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I should have fought harder for you, for us. I let my family and everyone else come between us, and I regret it every day." Lamia shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "It wasn't your fault. I felt like I didn't belong, like I would never fit into your world. I didn't want to be the reason you lost your family." Mwangi reached for her hand, holding it gently in his. "You belong with me. My world doesn't matter without you in it." Lamia's heart ached at his words, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that maybe they could find a way through the storm that had torn them apart. "We can't ignore that your family will always disapprove," Lamia said softly. "But I don't want to lose you, Mwangi. Not again." Mwangi smiled, his grip on her hand tightening. "Then let's stop worrying about what they think. This is about us. If they can't accept our love, then that's their problem, not ours." Lamia nodded, her heart swelling with hope. "We'll figure this out together." Mwangi leaned in, brushing a soft kiss against her forehead. Together. Over the next few weeks, Lamia and Mwangi worked to rebuild their relationship, piece by piece. They spent more time together, finding solace in the quiet moments when the rest of the world faded away, and it was just them. Lamia still had doubts about his family, about their future, but every time she was with Mwangi, those doubts seemed smaller, more manageable. One afternoon, Mwangi took her to a place he had been keeping secret for some time. It was a small piece of land on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by tall trees and open skies. Lamia looked around, confused at first, but Mwangi's expression was filled with excitement. I bought this land a while ago, he explained, his voice full of hope. It's where I want to build our home. Lamia's heart skipped a beat. Our home? Mwangi nodded, taking her hands in his. I've been thinking about the future, about what we want, and I realized that I want a life with you, a place where we can build something together, away from everything else. Lamia stared at him, overwhelmed by the depth of his love and his commitment to their future. She had never imagined something like this, never thought that someone like Mwangi would be willing to leave behind the expectations of his family, his world, just to be with her. You do that for me? She asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Mwangi smiled, his eyes filled with love. For us. Tears filled Lamia's eyes as she looked at the land around her, imagining the life they could build together. It wasn't the life she had expected, but it was one she now realized she wanted more than anything. I love you, Mwangi, she whispered, her heart full. Mwangi pulled her close, pressing a soft kiss to her lips. I love you too, Lamia. This is just the beginning. With their decision to build a future together, Mwangi and Lamia felt a renewed sense of hope. But there was one hurdle they both knew they couldn't avoid forever. Mwangi's family. Despite their determination to forge their own path, they understood that unless they confronted the family's disapproval, it would continue to cast a shadow over their relationship. One evening, as they sat together in the small cafe, Mwangi brought up the subject that had been lingering between them for days. I think it's time, he said quietly, reaching for Lamia's hand across the table. Time for me to speak to my father again. Lamia's heart clenched at the thought. She had seen firsthand the disapproval from Mwangi's family, and she didn't want to be the cause of any more conflict between him and his father. Are you sure? I don't want to force you into anything. Mwangi squeezed her hand gently. I'm sure. This isn't just about us anymore. If we're going to build a life together, we can't let this hang over us. I need to make my father understand that this is my decision, not his. Lamia nodded, her heart heavy but filled with admiration for Mwangi's strength. She knew how much his family meant to him, and she knew how difficult this conversation would be. But she also knew that he was willing to fight for their love, and that gave her the courage to stand by his side. The next morning, Mwangi drove to his family's estate. The familiar landscape felt different now, like a place that had once been home, but now seemed distant, disconnected from the life he wanted to live. As he walked into the grand living room, his father was waiting, sitting in his usual chair by the fire. Mwangi took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Father, we need to talk. Mr. Tembo glanced up, his expression unreadable. About what? About Lamia, Mwangi said firmly. About the fact that I'm going to marry her. His father's eyes narrowed, and for a long moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Finally, Mr. Tembo spoke, his voice cold. You're serious about this, aren't you? Mwangi met his father's gaze, unwavering. Yes, I love her, and I'm going to build a life with her, whether you approve or not. Mr. Tembo sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. For the first time, Mwangi saw something he hadn't expected, wariness, and maybe even a hint of regret. I wanted more for you, Mwangi, his father said quietly. I wanted you to marry someone from a family that could help you, someone who could elevate you. But I see now that this isn't about what I want. It's about what you want. Mwangi's heart raced. He hadn't expected his father to concede, not like this. If you love her, and you're sure about this, then I won't stand in your way, Mr. Tembo continued, his voice softer now. But understand that this is your choice. The consequences, good or bad, will be yours to face. Mwangi nodded, his chest tight with emotion. I understand, but I'm willing to take that risk. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Mr. Tembo smiled, a small, bittersweet smile. Then I wish you the best, son. The relief that washed over Mwangi after his conversation with his father was unlike anything he had ever felt. For so long, he had feared that his family would never accept his relationship with Lamia. But now, for the first time, he felt like they had a real chance. When he told Lamia about the conversation, she could hardly believe it. He really said that? She asked, her eyes wide with surprise. Mwangi smiled, pulling her into his arms. Yes, he said, he's not going to stand in our way. It's not everything we wanted, but it's enough. We can start building our life together. Lamia's heart swelled with happiness, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. She had never imagined they would reach this point, that Mwangi's family would finally step back and allow them to be together. I don't know what to say, she whispered, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions. Say yes, Mwangi said, his voice soft but steady. Say yes to building a life with me. Lamia looked up at him, her tears spilling over as she smiled. Yes, she whispered, her heart full of love. Yes, Mwangi, I'll build this life with you. And so they began to plan their future. The small piece of land that Mwangi had shown her became a symbol of the new life they would create together, far from the expectations of others, built on their love and trust in one another. Every decision they made was theirs alone, no longer dictated by the whispers of society or the demands of tradition. But as they prepared for their future, they knew that there were still challenges ahead. Though Mwangi's father had given his blessing, the rest of the family remained skeptical, and Lamia still felt the eyes of the world on her every time she stepped into Mwangi's life. But with each passing day, their bond grew stronger, and together they faced the uncertainties of their path. As their relationship blossomed, Mwangi and Lamia began to plan their wedding. They knew it wouldn't be an extravagant event. The last thing they wanted was a grand affair filled with people who didn't truly understand or support their love. Instead, they envisioned something small, intimate, and meaningful, a celebration of their journey and the love they had fought so hard to protect. The wedding was set to take place on the land where they would build their home, surrounded by close friends and a few family members who supported them. Lamia's family was there, standing by her side with pride, while Mwangi's sister, Layla, finally softened toward their relationship, realizing that her brother's happiness was all that mattered. Lamia stood in front of a small mirror, adjusting her simple but elegant dress, her heart fluttering with anticipation. Her mother entered the room, smiling warmly at her daughter. You look beautiful, Lamia. Lamia turned, tears welling in her eyes as she embraced her mother. I'm so happy you're here with me. Her mother kissed her forehead, her voice filled with pride. You've come so far, my daughter. I always knew you were strong, but seeing you today, I know that you're ready for this new life. Mwangi is lucky to have you. Lamia smiled through her tears, her heart filled with gratitude and love. As the ceremony began, Lamia stood at the edge of the field, waiting for her moment to walk down the aisle. Mwangi stood beneath a canopy of flowers, his gaze fixed on her as she approached. He looked at her with such love, such adoration, that it took Lamia's breath away. When she reached him, Mwangi took her hands in his, and the world seemed to fade away. It was just the two of them now, standing before their friends and family, ready to make the most important promise of their lives. The officiant began to speak, but Lamia barely heard the words. Her heart was racing, her emotions swirling, and all she could focus on was Mwangi's eyes, those eyes that had seen her, truly seen her, from the very beginning. When it was time for the vows, Mwangi spoke first. Lamia, he began, his voice steady and full of emotion. From the moment I met you, I knew my life would never be the same. You've shown me what love really means, what it means to fight for something that's worth everything. And I promise you, for the rest of my life, I will love you, protect you, and build a life with you. Together, we will face whatever comes our way, because with you, I have everything I need. Tears streamed down Lamia's face as she listened to his words, her heart swelling with love. When it was her turn, she took a deep breath and spoke from her soul. Mwangi, you changed my life in ways I never thought possible. You saw me when no one else did, and you loved me for who I am. I promise to love you with all my heart, to stand by your side through every storm, and to cherish every moment we have together. With you, I've found my home, and I will love you for the rest of my days. The vows were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they had been through, every trial, every challenge, and every victory. And as they exchanged rings, sealing their promise to one another, the sun seemed to shine a little brighter. The months following their wedding were filled with quiet happiness. Mwangi and Lamia began building their home on the land they had claimed as their own. each brick and beam a symbol of the life they were creating together. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of doubt, still whispers from those who didn't understand their love. But every challenge they faced together, and that made all the difference. Lamia continued to work at the cafe, but now she did so with a new sense of purpose. She was no longer the woman who doubted her place in the world. She had found her place, by Mwangi's side, building a future filled with love, hope, and possibility. Mwangi's relationship with his family remained complicated, but with time, they began to accept that his choice was his own. His father, though still distant, no longer interfered, and Layla, now a frequent visitor to their home, had become one of their strongest supporters. As the seasons changed, so did their lives. Their home grew, their love deepened, and soon they began to talk about the next chapter of their journey, starting a family of their own. Lamia felt a new excitement at the thought of bringing a child into the world, a child who would grow up surrounded by the love and strength they had built together. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their nearly completed home, watching the sun set over the horizon, Mwangi turned to Lamia, his heart full. "I never thought I could be this happy," he said quietly, his hand resting on hers. "But you've given me everything I ever wanted." Lamia smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "And you've given me a life I never imagined." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Their journey had been long, filled with challenges and heartache, but in the end they had found each other, and that was all that mattered. Years passed, and Lamia and Mwangi's love only grew stronger. Their home, once just a dream, was now filled with the laughter of children and the warmth of a family that had weathered every storm. Together, they had built a life that was richer than anything they had ever imagined, a life built not on wealth or status, but on love, trust, and unwavering commitment. Lamia often thought back to the early days of their relationship, when everything had seemed so uncertain. She remembered the doubts, the whispers, the obstacles that had once seemed insurmountable. But now, standing in the middle of the life they had created, she knew that every struggle had been worth it. One afternoon, as they played with their children in the garden, Mwangi turned to Lamia, a soft smile on his lips. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" he asked, his eyes filled with love. Lamia smiled, glancing at their children, their home, the life they had built together. "Every day." Mwangi pulled her close, kissing her forehead. "I wouldn't change a thing." Lamia looked up at him, her heart swelling with love. "Neither would I." As they stood together, watching their children chase each other through the flowers, Lamia knew that their love was the foundation of everything good in their lives. It was a love that had endured the test of time, of family, of society's expectations. And now it was a love that would carry them forward into the future. No matter what challenges life brought, they knew they would face them together, because theirs was a love that had been fought for, earned, and cherished, a love that would endure forever. Hey, TR World family! If you enjoyed this story and want to dive into more captivating tales, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. We have exciting content lined up, from romantic love stories to African folktales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and share it with your friends to spread the love. We love hearing from you. So drop your thoughts in the comments section below. Tell us what you think, what you'd like to see next, and what lessons stood out for you in today's story. Let's keep this conversation going. Thank you for being part of TR World, where stories come to life. Until next time, stay tuned and stay inspired.